Do not do so, my brothers. This the Almighty gave us, and He guarded us, and He gave the company that attacked us into our hands. Like the share of the man who goes down to battle, so shall the share of the one who stays behind with the baggage be. They shall divide equally. And David makes a decree, kept in his wars and forever after in Israel, at least during the periods when Israel was governed by Torah law. Episode 8. David and Shaul face the Philistines. In the last episode, we left David and Shaul, each going their separate ways, leaving on terms of peace with one another. David has dramatically demonstrated once again in the wilderness of Ziph, as he has in the cave in Ein Gedi, that he has been in a position to easily take Shaul's life, but instead he has refrained from raising his hand against the divinely anointed king. David once again confronts Shaul with the stark fact that he has no designs on Shaul's life, and Shaul, revealing his exalted, noble, and true heart, admits to David that David is in the right, and that he has erred, and he blesses David. Yet, says David to himself, he is nonetheless not safe from Shaul, because such moments of truth have occurred before, and yet still Shaul eventually resumes his pursuit of David. So David makes the difficult decision to leave the spiritual center of the creation of the universe, the land of Israel. As we understand, the omnipresent narrator, who is the Creator himself, reveals David's thoughts to us here. For, says David to himself, I may fall into Shaul's hands one day. There is no good course for me except to escape to the land of the Plishtim, and Shaul shall despair of finding me there, and will not seek me any more within the current borders of the land of Israel. David arises and takes the 600 men who are with him and passes over to the Philistine King Achish, the son of Maoch, the king of the city of Gath. And David dwells there with his two wives who accompanied him at that time, Abigail and Achinoam. Unlike the first time David has met Achish, where he had to feign madness in order to escape his clutches as the man who had killed Goliath, the Philistine champion. This time, David is not there alone, but rather as the leader of a formidable, if small, force of men. And because he is fleeing the man whom the Plishtim know to be the king of Israel, Shaul, and the sworn enemy of the Plishtim, David is welcomed as a potential ally against a common enemy and treated with honor. David humbly requests that he be granted the right to dwell separately with the Jews who accompany him in a different town in Achish's kingdom. For, he tells Achish, why should your servant, for so David refers to himself in relation to the king Achish, why should your servant dwell in the royal city with the king? So Achish gives him Tsiklag, which becomes a dwelling place for the tribe of Yehudah from that day on. From there, David and his men enter the land of Israel again to battle the Geshurim, the Grizim, and the implacable enemy, the Amalakites, whom they put to the sword, per the commandment of the Almighty. And they return to Achish. King Achish is surprised and worried that David and his men have been engaged in battle, asking for details. But David would tell him after each raid only that they had attacked in the land of Yehudah, which is of course true, and the Negev also true, leading Achish to surmise that they had attacked their own people, whereas their action had only been against the Amalekites and the various Canaanite peoples dwelling there. Achish believes that David has betrayed the children of Israel, thinking, again the omnipresent narrator, he has really come to hate his people Israel, and he will be my servant forever. Achish's reaction is to make David and his men his own royal guards, a common practice among the Plishtim, who suspect that their own men would organize rebellions against them, and so rely on foreign royal guards to keep them safe. But this arrangement was about to be sorely tested. The divine spirit has increasingly departed from King Shaul, especially since the death of the Navi Shmuel, the Prophet Shmuel, who has spoken the will of the Almighty during Shaul's rule. As a result, the enemies of the children of Israel gain new courage to attack them. The Plishtim muster their armies for that purpose, and King Achish says to David, "Know that you will come with me to the camp of war, you and your men." To which David replies, "You shall see what your servant will do." "In that case," says Achish, "I will appoint you as my personal bodyguard." This puts David and his men in a very difficult position. Under no circumstances was David prepared to betray his people for the Plishtim, and despite his vague answer to King Achish, there are no good options available to him. Either David has to leave King Achish, showing him to be disloyal, or he has to show utter disloyalty to the people of Israel. David has bought himself time and breathing room with his vague reply, but the basic conundrum remains. Meanwhile, the Plishtim, roused to achieve victory against their longtime enemy, the Jews, not only mobilize all their troops, but also rush those troops into the land of Israel, encamping at Shunem in the Yizreel Valley near Mount Gilboa, where Shaul has mustered his own troops. Unlike the Plishtim, Shaul is not about to advance against the overwhelming force arrayed against him. That is especially so because he has attempted to consult the Almighty directly via the Urim and Thummim and via the prophets who were Shmuel's disciples. But the Almighty is silent. Shaul increasingly realizes that he has been replaced by David, but he is in an impossible position because after all, he is still the official king of Israel. The pathos of the king at this hour of great peril, menaced from without and with a stony silence from the Almighty within, causes a sense of desperation in Shaul. And so, in his desperation, Shaul makes the unlikely choice to consult a woman practicing necromancy in Endor, in the ancient Hebrew, a balas ov, one who divines the future using the dark arts from voices emanating from bones. This practice is of course strictly forbidden by the Torah itself, on pain of death, and it speaks to Shaul's desperation that he is willing to consult such a woman at all. If the prophet Shmuel had not recently died, Shmuel himself would have forbidden this course of action. But Shaul once again reasons incorrectly, demonstrating his tendency to interpret too broadly, that the actual prohibition was in the actual consultation of the bones themselves, rather than consulting the woman who consults the bones. And so he seeks her out, but not before he disguises himself, discarding his kingly garments and donning the clothes of a common person. But she, this Witch of Endor, as she is called in English, reacts in horror when Shaul seeks her out, even though she indeed did not at first recognize him as the king. For she knows that King Shaul, who is a righteous king, has caused all those who deal in black magic, including those who consult the Ov bones like herself, in order to tell the future. He has caused them all to be executed by royal decree in accordance with the injunction of the Torah to eliminate all those defiling the land with black magic. The Witch of Endor reminds Shaul in disguise that the king has carried out this sentence against those dabbling in bone divination as a capital crime under Torah law, and that now, by coming to her and asking her to perform this black magic, he is seeking to get her killed. But he swears to her by the Almighty himself that she will not be harmed, and so she agrees, asking him whose spirit she wants him to call up. To this he replies, "Bring up Shmuel from the dead." At that, the Witch of Endor sees Shmuel rising, and she screams in a loud voice to Shaul reproachfully, for she knows now who her disguised guest is. Why did you trick me? You are Shaul." The king then says to her, "Do not fear me, for Shaul knows that it was in his power to spare her life as the king." He says to her, "What did you see? What is his appearance?" She replies, "I saw a great man ascending from the earth. An elderly man is ascending, and he wears a cloak." Shaul knows at once that it is indeed the Prophet Shmuel, and he prostrates himself before him upon the ground. Shmuel says to him, "Why do you anger me by raising me up from the next world?" For after all, being called up by a witch is exactly the opposite of what Shmuel seeks for his anointed king, whom he had taken such good care to pray for. Shaul replies, "Distress afflicts me, and the Plishtim are waging war against me, and the Almighty has removed himself from me, and has not answered me any more, neither by the prophets nor in dreams. And I have called you to let me know what I should do." We can hear the fear and desperation in Shaul's plea to his former advisor, the chosen prophet, to lead the children of Israel. He misses the closeness to the Almighty. And Shmuel says to Shaul, "And why should you ask me? But the Almighty has left you and has become your adversary. And the Almighty has done what he spoke through me. And the Almighty has torn the kingship from your hands and has given it to your fellow, to David, because you did not hear the voice of the Almighty and did not visit his burning anger on Amalek. Therefore he does this thing to you this day. And the Almighty also shall give the children of Israel with you into the hands of the Plishtim. And tomorrow you and your sons with you and the army of Israel the Almighty shall give into the hands of the Plishtim." And Shaul quickly falls to the ground prostrate, and is in great fear from the words of Shmuel, and has no energy, for he has not eaten bread the entire day and the entire night before. And the Witch of Endor comes to Shaul and sees that he is in great shock and fear. And she says to him, "Behold, your maidservant," meaning herself, "has obeyed you, and I took my life in my hand in doing as you told me. And I listened to the words that you spoke to me. And now, you too, heed the voice of your maidservant. I will place bread before you, and eat, and there will be strength in you when you go on the way." But Shaul refuses and says, "I will not eat." And his servants beseech him, and also the woman, and he heeds their voice. And he arises from the ground and sits on the bed. And the woman hurries to slaughter a young calf, and she takes flour and kneads it, and bakes matzah for him, for it is the Passover holiday. And she places the food before Shaul and before his servants, and they eat, and they arise, and they leave that night. Meanwhile, the Plishtim have gathered their forces and are now encamped at Aphek, while Shaul and his forces are encamped at the spring of Yisrael. This moment poses a seemingly unbearable dilemma for David and his men, because to fight the children of Israel on behalf of their sworn enemies, the Plishtim, would be intolerable for them. They are not with Achish out of treachery to the children of Israel, but simply as a means of escaping the wrath of Shaul against David, their leader. The high leaders of the Plishtim are passing with the hundreds and thousands under their command, and David and his men are passing in the rear with Achish the king. The Philistine officers complain to the king, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish replies to the Philistine officers, "Is this not David, the servant of Shaul, king of Israel, who has been with me for these days and years, and I have found no fault in him from the day he dwelt with me until today?" But the Philistine officers are angry with him, and they say to him, "Send this man back, and let him return to the place you assigned him. Let him not go down to wage battle with us, so that he not prove to be our opponent in battle. And with what will this man find favor with his lords? Surely with the heads of our men. Is this not the same David of whom they sang with dancing, saying, 'Shaul smote thousands, but David smote tens of thousands'?" And they reminded Achish that this is the hero of Israel, who slew the Philistine giant Goliath. Achish has no choice but to dismiss David, sending him back to Ziklag, where he and his men have been dwelling. Achish does so apologetically, telling David that he knows he is upright and true. David protests vehemently the injustice of the Plishti officer's judgment of him. Yet for David, this abrupt dismissal by King Achish of Gat, the Plishti, is nothing less than an act of divine intervention and personal salvation. For David has been saved from being put into the impossible position of disobeying the king who hosts him, and on the other hand, being expected to do battle with the children of Israel. David and his men depart for home, but as it turns out, the chaos in the area is not only due to the impending clash between the Plishtim and the children of Israel. They arrive on the third day of their journey in Ziklag, and they arrive to a scene of utter devastation. The Amalekites, spreading through the south of the land, have conquered and burned the town to the ground. They did not kill the people they found there, but instead captured the women and children alive and took them with them as they moved on to further pillaging. When David and his men arrive, they raise their voices and weep until they have no more strength to weep. Among the others, both of David's wives who were there, Achinoam and Abigail, have been captured. Adding to David's distress is that his men blame him for this disaster, because every man's heart is embittered due to the capture of their wives and sons and daughters. But David trusts in the Almighty and does not despair. He believes fervently that the Almighty will grant him victory here as well. David says to Evyatar, the son of Achimelech, "Bring the ephod to me now." David inquires of the Urim and Thummim, asking, "Shall I pursue this company of Amalekites? Will I reach them?" The Almighty answers him, "Pursue them, you will reach them, and you will surely rescue." So David and his 600 men depart, and they arrive at the Besor stream in the western Negev desert, which flows from the Negev through what is today the southern Gaza Strip and on into the sea. There, 200 men remain guarding their excess baggage and not going on, for they are too exhausted to continue the pursuit, while the remaining 400 men, together with David as their commander, continue the pursuit. They find an Egyptian youth in a field, half dead, and take him to David. As it turns out, this Egyptian youth is a slave of the Amalekites, but he has become ill, and the Amalekites simply discarded him in the field to die, as that cruel and heartless people are wont to do with human life. In exchange for a promise that his life is to be spared, and that he will not be betrayed to his former Amalekite masters, the youth agrees to lead David and his men to the Amalekite band. And there they are, the Amalekites, spread across the face of the fields, eating and drinking and cavorting with all the great loot, the spoils they have pillaged from the land of the Plishtim and the land of Yehudah. And from the setting of the sun until the setting of the sun of the next day, David smites them. Not even a single man of the Amalekites survives, except for 400 youthful camel riders who managed to flee. David rescues everything the Amalekites have taken, and also his 2 wives. Not a single person is missing, from whether great or small, neither sons nor daughters, including their spoils. David returns everything. He takes all the Amalekite sheep and cattle and says, "These are the spoils of David," for these had formerly been the property of others, by now unknown, people whom the Amalekites had despoiled on their journey of pillage and destruction, people who by now have surely despaired of seeing their animals again, to the extent the Amalekites have even spared those people's lives. And none of these animals have a sign that would allow them to be returned. So David and his 400 men returned to the stream of Besor, and there the 200 men stationed there, when they had been unable to follow during their exhaustion, come to meet David and those who are with him. At that moment, seeing them, every person of a wicked heart and a person without the yoke of heaven upon him speaks up from among the men who have gone with David, and these people say, "Because they did not go with me, nothing will be given to them from the spoils that we managed to save, except that every man's wife and children shall be given to them, and let them take them and go." But David opposes this mean-spirited and disunified outlook decisively. Do not do so, my brothers. This the Almighty gave us, and he guarded us, and he gave the company that attacked us into our hands. Like the share of the man who goes down to battle, so shall the share of the one who stays behind with the baggage be. They shall divide equally. And David makes a decree, kept in his wars and forever after in Israel, at least during the periods when Israel was governed by Torah law, that those who remain behind shall share equally in the spoils of war. This recognition of the oneness of the Jewish people at all times, including times of war, is a contribution of David for the ages. It is ironic that when the Jews return to their land, this same issue should arise as a wedge issue among those with a bad eye, to drive a wedge between different segments of the Jewish population dwelling in the land, and particularly against those who contribute to the Jewish people through learning and through the fulfilling of mitzvahs. But as David's son Shlomo, the wisest of all men, wrote, there is nothing new under the sun. David also sends some of the spoils to his allies among the children of Israel with a message. Here is a gift for you from the spoils of the enemies of the Almighty. He sends them to those dwelling in Beit El, in Ramot Negev, and to those in Yatir, and to those in Aroer, and to those in Siphoth, and to those in the cities of the Canaan, and to those in Hormah, and to those in Kor Ashan, and those in Athach, and to those in Hebron, and to those in all the places where David and his men have traveled. We now provide some of the Dvash Tachas Halashan, as usual, the honey under the tongue, of the deeper meaning of some of the stories from this episode. With regard to the Witch of Endor, the Gemara, the Babylonian Talmud, in Maseches Shabbos, the tractate Shabbos, brings a question asked as a challenge to the sages by a heretic, the Tzaduki, or in English, a Sadducee. The question is quite simply this. The Prophet Shmuel was the spiritual leader of his generation, a tremendously righteous and pious person. Surely he, more than anyone, merited and received his world to come, an honored place of eternal life in Gan Eden, loosely translated as heaven, or literally the Garden of Eden of the upper worlds. How could it be then that the Witch of Endor, using her dark arts, relying on the impure bones of dead animals, could exert influence on the holy upper worlds, such that the soul of the exalted prophet Shmuel would appear to her as a result of her black magic? The answer given by the sages of the Gemara is that the Witch of Endor was only able to exert her influence during the first 12 months after Shmuel's death. That is because during that time, the body is in a process of decay whereby the soul, whose place is indeed in the highest worlds, periodically returns to visit the physical body that hosts the soul in this world during his soul's lifetime in this world. Thus, there is still an aspect of Shmuel's soul that is present with his body at that time. However, that is the only reason for the power of the Witch of Endor's black arts to summon a small emanation of Shmuel from beyond the grave. After the 12-month period during which the soul is fully separated from the body and waits in the place of waiting for the revival of the dead in Gan Eden, certainly the black magic of the Witch of Endor would have absolutely no power then over Shmuel's soul in the higher worlds. The larger point is, of course, that the power of Kedusha, of holiness and connection to the Almighty, is always far greater than the power of the dark arts. There is no comparison in truth between their powers, and ultimately the divine will always prevails over the darkness. The Almighty and those who represent his divine will always ultimately win, without fail. In the next episode, we witness the climactic final act of the struggle that the Almighty has set up between David and King Shaul, as the Plishtim attack once again, with King Shaul and his sons fighting desperately for their lives and for the survival of the Jewish people. It is at this moment that the unparalleled nobility of both King Shaul and the young David, the future king and progenitor of both the kings and the ultimate redeemer of Israel, come to the fore once again in the dramatic conclusion to this epic conflict.